For years, neighbors laughed at a woman living in an old, dilapidated shed, considering her poor and unhappy. But one day, they had to go inside, and what they saw there changed their perception of her completely. Subscribe and write where you're watching this video from. The outskirts of town had a way of feeling separate from the rest of the world, as though time had slowed there decades ago and decided never to resume its pace. The main street gave way to narrower roads, then to gravel paths, and finally to ruts worn into the earth by long-forgotten carts. Here, the air carried the scent of wild grass and damp soil, mingling with the faint tang of rust from old wire fences and abandoned farming equipment. It was a quiet place, the kind of quiet that made distant bird calls sound startlingly close, and where the rustle of leaves in the wind could be mistaken for a whisper. At the very edge of this slow, sleepy expanse stood a small, weather-beaten structure, an unassuming wooden shed that most people overlooked without a second thought. It was not the kind of building to catch the eye for its charm or architecture. In fact, if anything, it inspired a faint sense of melancholy. Its walls, once painted a bright and welcoming color, had long since surrendered to the elements. The paint curled and peeled away in strips, revealing the silver-gray wood beneath, bleached by years of relentless sun and scoured by rain. Along one side, the boards had warped outward, giving the impression that the structure was leaning in exhaustion. Moss crept along the edges of the roof, which sagged ever so slightly, as though burdened by too many winters. The door, hanging crookedly on rusted hinges, seemed perpetually one storm away from detaching completely. A handful of weeds, tall and stubborn, grew wild around the base, their roots gripping the soil with a determination that mirrored the building's own stubborn survival. For those passing by, it was easy to make assumptions. To some, it looked like the remnant of a bygone era, perhaps once used to store tools or firewood, now nothing more than a useless relic. Others imagined it as a place of hardship, perhaps home to someone too poor or too isolated to live elsewhere. A few didn't think about it at all, their eyes sliding over it the way one ignores a broken fence post or a pothole in the road. In the evenings, when the sun dipped behind the hills and shadows lengthened, the shed seemed to blend into the gloom, becoming part of the landscape's forgotten corners. Yet sometimes, on certain nights when the moon was high or the sky was clear, a faint amber glow could be seen through the cracks in the walls and around the edges of the door. The light was soft and steady, not the harsh glare of a bare bulb, but the warm shimmer of a lamp or candles. Occasionally, if one looked closely, a silhouette would move across that glow, a figure at a table, perhaps, head bowed in concentration. It was in those moments that curiosity stirred in the hearts of the few who noticed. Who lived there, in that decaying shell? What sort of life was possible within those rotting boards? Amina was her name, though most in town knew little more than that. She was 30 years old, with a quiet composure that seemed to keep people at a distance without ever being unkind. Her skin was the deep, rich brown of freshly turned earth, her features fine and symmetrical, framed by hair she often pulled back into a neat coil at the nape of her neck. She dressed simply, loose linen shirts, faded jeans, practical boots, and carried herself with a kind of understated grace that suggested she had no need to announce her presence. Amina's trips into town were infrequent and purposeful, a weekly visit to the market, a stop at the post office, perhaps a walk through the second-hand shop on Main Street. She spoke politely when spoken to, but her words were economical, her smile brief and reserved. Those who had lived in the area long enough recalled that she had arrived a few years ago, moving into the old shed that stood on a parcel of land no one else wanted. The property had belonged to her grandfather, though few remembered much about him beyond his fondness for solitude. When Amina took over, there had been idle talk, guesses about her finances, her reasons for choosing such a dilapidated place. Some concluded she simply couldn't afford better. Others speculated that she liked being away from people. A few, less charitable, spun stranger tales, suggesting she was hiding from something or someone. Over time, the gossip faded into the background hum of the town's other preoccupations, but the shed and its occupant remained a small curiosity. From the outside, there was nothing to contradict these assumptions. The yard was unkempt, the building unchanged in its weathered state. Children sometimes dared each other to peek inside, but none had ever worked up the courage. Adults passed it by with only a glance, shaking their heads at what they imagined to be a cold, damp, and empty interior. It was simply one of those things everyone thought they understood, yet no one truly knew. Amina, for her part, seemed content with this arrangement. She moved through the world like a stone in a river, still unobtrusive, letting the current flow around her. There was a certain intentionality to the way she maintained the shed's outward disrepair. She never repainted the walls or fixed the sagging roof in a way that could be seen from the road. To the casual eye, nothing about the place suggested life, much less comfort, and that, in its way, suited her perfectly. The less people thought about what was inside, the more she could keep it to herself. At dusk, the road past her property would empty of travelers. The last rays of sunlight would catch on the jagged edges of the shed's boards, turning them briefly to gold before surrendering them to shadow. The air would cool, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke from chimneys in the distance. Somewhere inside, unseen hands would strike a match, light a lamp, and fill the air with the warm, honeyed glow that transformed the space within. Out in the dark, no one could see the expression on Amina's face as she settled into her evening, but if they could, they might have sensed the quiet satisfaction of someone who had built a world entirely her own. In the small hours, when the town slept, the shed would stand silent once more. The light would fade, the interior hidden again, and the building would resume its role as a piece of scenery in the long, slow play of the countryside. Yet the truth of it, that inside this tired, leaning shell lay something far from ruin, remained untouched, waiting for the day when circumstance or chance might reveal it to another soul. Until then, the mystery was hers alone, a secret life nested within the weathered bones of the old structure on the outskirts. The morning light slipped quietly over the hills and into the valley, touching the weathered boards of the shed with a faint, pale glow. From the road, nothing had changed since the evening before. The moss still clung stubbornly to the roof, the paint still flaked in curling strips, and the weeds in the yard swayed in the breeze as if no human foot had disturbed them for months. But, past the crooked door, past the illusion of neglect and abandonment, the truth of Amina's home revealed itself like the turning of a hidden page in a book only she could read. Inside, the first impression was warmth, not the oppressive heat of summer or the dry blast of an electric heater, but a steady, enveloping warmth that seemed to come from the very walls, as though the wood itself had absorbed years of gentle firelight and released it slowly back into the air. The scent was part of it too, a subtle blend of polished cedar, fresh coffee, and the faint mineral tang of clay. The space was small, but it didn't feel cramped. Every surface, every corner had a purpose, and yet nothing appeared cluttered. There was room to breathe, to think, to create. The living space unfolded in a single open room, carefully divided into areas by changes in texture and color rather than by walls. Directly opposite the door, a wide wooden beam stretched across the ceiling, its grain rich and golden from years of careful oiling. Beneath it, a worn but sturdy rug lay on the floor, its deep red and blue patterns softened by time. A low table sat in the center, its surface bearing the marks of many years, scratches, small burns, and the faint circular stains of cups. Beside it, a pair of mismatched armchairs faced one another, each draped with a hand-woven throw. To the left was the kitchen, a compact but thoughtfully arranged corner that spoke of both practicality and beauty. Amina had built the countertops herself from reclaimed wood, sanding them smooth and sealing them with a finish that brought out their natural warmth. Open shelves held rows of earthenware mugs, chipped but clean, along with jars of dried herbs and teas. A small cast-iron stove stood in one corner, beside a sink with a vintage brass faucet that gleamed in the morning light. Above the sink, a window framed the view of the trees outside, their leaves shifting in the wind like green glass. Against the far wall, opposite the kitchen, stood Amina's workshop. Here, the room shifted from the softness of home to the purposeful mess of a creative space. A pottery wheel sat near another window, a scattering of clay scraps on the floor beneath it. Several unfinished vases and bowls rested on a shelf to dry, their surfaces etched with delicate patterns. A table nearby held paints and brushes, rolls of fabric, and a small wooden box filled with sewing needles and threads in every imaginable color. This was where Amina's hands did their best work, where she transformed salvaged materials into pieces of art or utility. It was here that the quiet magic of her home truly began. The sleeping area was tucked away in a slightly elevated corner, raised on a platform of polished planks. A simple bed was laid with crisp linen sheets and a thick quilt, stitched from pieces of fabric that seemed to carry their own histories. A gauzy canopy hung overhead, catching the light in a way that softened the edges of the space. Beside the bed, a small table held a stack of books and a lamp with a ceramic base she had shaped herself. The effect was one of a peaceful seclusion, a place set apart for rest in a life otherwise filled with work. It had not always been like this. Amina could still remember the day she first stepped inside and found nothing but emptiness, bare beams, dirt underfoot, drafts whistling through the gaps in the walls. The transformation had been slow, almost painstaking. She had begun by sealing the roof and shoring up the weakest parts of the structure, learning as she went. For insulation, she scavenged discarded rolls from a construction site, bartering her pottery in exchange for materials others considered scrap. She framed windows into the solid walls with careful precision, salvaging glass panes from a demolished school and fitting them into place by hand. The difference was immediate. The sunlight seemed to breathe life into the space, chasing away the stale chill. Electricity had come next, not through the town's grid but by her own means. A set of solar panels, second-hand but serviceable, now rested on the southern slope of the roof, soaking in the daylight and feeding a modest battery bank hidden beneath the bed platform. For water, she set up a system to collect rain in large barrels, filtering it through layers of sand, charcoal, and gravel before it reached her taps. These choices were not just born of necessity. They reflected her desire to live lightly on the land, to create a home that sustained her without taking more than it needed. Her furniture told its own story. The chairs had once been destined for a landfill before she rescued and reupholstered them. The low table had been a workbench in a carpenter's shop decades ago, its surface worn smooth by hands long gone. Even the rug had been mended repeatedly, each stitch a mark of defiance against the wastefulness she saw in the world beyond her door. To Amina, these things were not relics of a poorer life, but treasures, each chosen and cared for until they became part of the fabric of her home. Living here required discipline and attention. There was no space for things without purpose, no room for carelessness. Every day had its rhythms, tending the small herb garden she kept in pots by the windows, sweeping the floor free of clay dust, checking the barrels after a rainstorm, turning her works in progress to ensure they dried evenly. Yet, within these routines, she found a sense of freedom she had never known in the noise and hurry of the city. Here, there were no landlords to please, no neighbors pressing for gossip, no expectations she had to meet. The shed, in all its deceptive humility, had become a sanctuary. Outside, the world still saw a sagging roof and faded paint. But within these four walls there was harmony, a life shaped with patience, skill, and the quiet refusal to conform to what others thought a home should be. It was a place where every inch held her touch, where beauty and necessity coexisted without waste. And though Amina knew that eventually circumstances might bring someone across her threshold, for now the secret was hers, a treasure guarded not by locks or fences, but by the very assumptions that kept the curious at bay. In the afternoons, as the sun slanted in through the salvaged windows and painted golden stripes across the floor, Amina would often pause in her work and simply look around. She saw not the limitations of the space, but the way it had grown into exactly what she needed it to be. Every brushstroke of paint, every stitch in the quilt, every polished surface told a piece of her story. And though no one else knew that story yet, it lived here fully, in the inner world she had built behind the unremarkable face of the old shed on the outskirts. The afternoon was quiet, save for the occasional sound of wind pushing against the old boards of the shed and the distant hum of a car making its way along the main road. Inside, Amina sat at her work table, smoothing the damp surface of a clay bowl, her fingers moving with the steady confidence of someone who had done this countless times. She could feel the sun shifting in the sky through the warmth on her shoulders from the window behind her. It was one of those still days when the outside world seemed far away, almost unreal. Yet she knew with a sort of resigned certainty that the world beyond her door often had its own opinions about her life here, opinions born not from knowledge but from glances and assumptions. In town, the shed was a topic that surfaced in quiet conversations, often when people believed she was too far away to hear. The older women outside the grocery store would lower their voices, tilting their heads toward one another as they commented on that poor girl who lived all alone in that falling-down building. Some imagined her days filled with cold nights and meager meals, the picture of someone just barely getting by. Others were less sympathetic, their remarks tinged with a kind of dismissive skepticism, as though choosing to live in such a place must be some form of laziness or eccentricity. They spoke with the casual authority of those who believed they could sum up another's life from a single glance at a crooked door and peeling paint. Among the younger ones in town, especially the teenagers with too much time and too little to do, the shed became the source of more colorful tales. They would stand near the edge of the schoolyard or at the convenience store, daring one another to sneak closer to her property. Some claimed she was a recluse because she was hiding something, a stash of strange treasures perhaps, or something darker. The more imaginative told stories that turned her into a figure of mystery, almost folklore. The witch who could make something out of nothing, the strange woman who never came to community events, the one who must have secrets worth guarding. The truth, of course, was that none of them had ever stepped inside. Amina was not oblivious to these whispers, though she rarely gave them much weight. She had lived long enough to understand that people often feared or judged what they did not understand. In a small town where routines were predictable and faces familiar, anything unusual stood out, and her life here, on the outskirts, in a place that looked like it might collapse in the next storm, was unusual enough to feed idle speculation. Yet she saw a certain usefulness in it. The appearance of poverty, the impression of neglect, acted like a natural barrier. It kept away those who might otherwise pry, giving her the solitude she valued. In a way, the very misconceptions about her were part of what protected the life she had built. Still, there were days when the weight of those unseen judgments pressed in. A trip to the market could sometimes feel like navigating a gauntlet of quick glances and murmured words, her presence sparking silent questions she had no interest in answering. She kept her responses polite, her expression neutral, never offering more than was necessary. The city had taught her the dangers of openness, the way people could take kindness as an invitation to overstep. Here, in the quiet edge of the countryside, she intended to keep her boundaries firm. The contrast between what the townspeople imagined and what truly existed inside her home was almost laughable. She could step out into her yard to hang a quilt in the sun and know that a passerby would see only the fraying hem and not the intricate stitching that told the story of hours of work. They would see her return from the woods with a bundle of twigs and think she was gathering fuel because she couldn't afford anything better, never knowing the twigs were for sculptural frames she used in her pottery display. It was as though the outside world had decided on a version of her life long ago, and no amount of truth could override it. There was a certain memory she returned to often, one that explained more than she ever voiced aloud. Years before, in the city, she had rented a small apartment in a building where the neighbors were quick to ask questions about everything: where she worked, who visited her, how she spent her evenings. She had thought at first it was friendliness, but over time it became clear that they weren't seeking connection. They were gathering pieces of her life to examine, judge, and, on occasion, gossip about. When she lost her job and could no longer afford the rent, the same neighbors who had once smiled warmly spoke of her in hushed tones, speculating about her choices and her worth. That experience had taught her how quickly appearances could shape opinions, and how often those opinions said more about the beholder than the subject. Here, she chose the opposite approach. The shed's exterior, with its sagging roof and weathered boards, was not just the result of time and weather. It was her decision. She maintained it just enough to keep it sound, but never enough to invite admiration or curiosity. She let the weeds grow taller than they needed to. She left the paint to peel naturally, never sanding it down. It was a disguise of sorts, a mask for the life inside. It meant fewer knocks on the door, fewer strangers wandering up her path. If some people wanted to believe she lived in hardship, she was content to let them. Every now and then, there would be someone in town, a clerk at the store, a passerby at the post office, whose tone carried a different edge. These were the ones who, perhaps without meaning to, revealed their bias in more cutting ways. They spoke as though living simply, without the trappings of conventional success, was something shameful. Sometimes it was in their words, other times in the faintly patronizing tilt of the head, the glance that measured her clothes, her groceries, her lack of a car. It was not anger that rose in her then, but a quiet resolve. Let them think what they would. Their view of her was not her responsibility to correct. The irony was that the very life they judged was the one that had brought her the most peace she had ever known. She thought of this as she finished shaping the clay bowl, setting it carefully on a shelf to dry. In the stillness of her workshop, with the filtered light turning the room to amber and the faint chirp of birds outside, she felt a kind of satisfaction that no outside approval could match. Beyond these walls, the shed might be seen as a place of neglect, but within them it was a home rich with meaning, each object and surface chosen with care, each day shaped by her own hands. Evening began to fall, the light shifting toward gold, casting long shadows through the salvaged windows. She stood for a moment, gazing at the beams of sunlight that stretched across the rug, their warmth softening the room even as the air outside cooled. There was comfort in knowing that what others misunderstood had become her shield. She didn't need to explain herself to anyone. Not here. Not now. In the fading light, the shed looked no different to the rest of the world than it had that morning. To them, it was still just an old structure on the outskirts, leaning toward its own decay. But to Amina, it remained the sanctuary she had chosen, its beauty hidden safely in plain sight, away from the reach of prejudice. The storm had rolled in without much warning. In the early morning, the sky had been a pale, brittle blue, the kind that carried a deceptive calm, and Amina had stepped outside to collect rainwater from the barrels, expecting nothing more than a few scattered clouds before the evening. By midday, however, the air had shifted. The light dimmed, the wind grew restless, and a faint rumble began to stir on the horizon. She could smell the metallic edge of rain before the first drops fell, and by the time she finished securing the shutters on the eastern side of the shed, the sky had become an unbroken sheet of gray. It was the sort of storm that seemed determined to sweep across the land with no regard for what it left in its wake. Inside, the sound of rain on the roof grew steady and insistent, punctuated by the occasional groan of the old beams adjusting to the wind's pressure. Amina had settled herself near the stove with a mug of tea, her hands wrapped around the warmth, listening to the storm build its voice. She liked storms in a way, the way they made the rest of the world retreat. In the city, rain had been something to endure. Here, it was something to witness, to feel. Yet, as the afternoon deepened and the wind's howl rose to a near constant, she began to hear another sound, faint at first, then growing clearer. It was the unmistakable thrum of an engine struggling on wet ground, paired with the squelching protest of tires losing their grip in mud. She set her mug aside and crossed to the nearest window, brushing aside the linen curtain. Through the sheet of rain, she saw a small car at the edge of her property, its headlights cutting pale, fractured beams through the downpour. The vehicle was angled awkwardly, one wheel spinning uselessly in the rut it had dug itself into. Even from a distance, she could make out two figures inside, one in the driver's seat, leaning forward as if willing the car to move, and another in the passenger seat, glancing around in visible frustration. The road beyond them was nearly deserted. No one else would be coming by to help any time soon. For a moment, she hesitated. She was not in the habit of inviting strangers into her space, not here, not in the home she had so carefully shielded from the eyes and hands of the outside world. Yet, the rain was relentless, and the temperature had begun to drop. The car was clearly going nowhere, and the wind had reached a pitch that made even standing outside an effort. She knew what it was to be stuck with no place to go, and though she valued her solitude, she was not without compassion. By the time she stepped outside, pulling her coat tightly around her and bracing against the gusts, The driver had already climbed out and was attempting to push the car free. Mud clung to his shoes and streaked his jeans, his hands slipping against the slick metal. The woman in the passenger seat had opened her door, looking around with a mixture of discomfort and disbelief at their surroundings. Both of them turned sharply when Amina approached, her figure half hidden beneath the hood of her coat. "You're not going to get that out in this weather," she called over the wind, her voice carrying more firmly than she felt. The man straightened, clearly weighing whether to argue, then shook his head in resignation. The woman's shoulders hunched against the rain as she stepped out, clutching her bag tightly. It was not a conversation that needed many words. They were wet, cold, and far from anywhere they could take shelter. Amina gestured toward the shed, turning back without waiting for a response, trusting that the force of the storm would make the decision for them. She could hear their footsteps behind her as they followed, the sound of water splashing in the deepening puddles. The moment she pushed the door open and stepped inside, the shift in atmosphere was almost tangible. The warmth from the stove, the faint scent of cedar and clay, the glow of the lamps, all of it was such a stark contrast to the gray, howling chaos outside that it seemed to catch them off guard. They paused just inside the threshold, dripping water onto the rug, their eyes adjusting to the softer light. Amina removed her coat and hung it on the peg near the door, watching them take in the space. At first, neither of them spoke. Their gaze moved from the polished beams above to the quilt-covered bed in the corner, to the shelves lined with handcrafted pottery and jars of herbs. The man's eyes lingered on the kitchen's brass fixtures, while the woman glanced toward the workshop, where the pottery wheel sat beside the window. It was clear they had expected something entirely different. Perhaps bare walls, a rickety table, the kind of sparse interior that matched the exterior's story. Instead, they were faced with a room that was both functional and beautiful, shaped by a deliberate hand. "You live here?" the woman asked at last, her voice carrying a note of disbelief that she didn't seem to notice. Amina simply nodded, moving to pour them each a mug of tea without offering further explanation. They accepted the cups gratefully, warming their hands around them as they shed their wet coats. The wind rattled against the windows, reminding them of what they had escaped. As they sipped their tea, their eyes continued to wander, curiosity replacing the awkwardness of their arrival. They asked small questions at first: how she kept the place warm, how she managed the lighting, and Amina answered in short, measured sentences. She was aware of the widening in their expressions, the way each answer seemed to deepen their astonishment. It was not pride she felt exactly, but a quiet acknowledgement that, for once, someone else could see what she saw every day, the life she had built inside these walls. The storm outside showed no sign of relenting, and so they remained, drying off by the stove, their voices growing more relaxed as the hours passed. Eventually, they ventured into talking about themselves, their car trouble, their trip through the countryside, the wrong turn that had led them here. Amina listened, offering the occasional nod, her hands busy with small tasks, refilling their tea, stirring the pot on the stove, adjusting the lamp's wick. It was only when she caught the woman glancing toward the bed platform for the third time, her eyes tracing the hand-stitched patterns of the quilt, that Amina realized this moment was something neither of them would forget soon. Strangers had crossed her threshold and seen the truth hidden behind the shed's facade. For years, she had kept that truth to herself, letting the outside world believe what it wanted. Now, by chance and by weather, two more people carried a different picture of her life. One she hadn't planned to share. As the evening crept in and the storm began to lose its strength, the wind softening to a low, restless murmur, she found herself strangely untroubled by their presence. They would leave soon enough, returning to their own lives, their own places. But for now they sat together in the glow of the lamps, the air filled with the quiet crackle of the stove and the occasional sigh of the old beams. And though she had not invited them by choice, she recognized that sometimes the walls we build to keep the world out can, on rare occasions, let in exactly the kind of company we never expected. When the storm finally broke in the early hours of the morning, it did so quietly, as if it had spent the last of its rage in the night. By the time Amina stirred from the light sleep she allowed herself, the air outside was still and heavy with the scent of wet earth. The rain had washed the dust from the trees, leaving the leaves dark and glossy. Through the window, the ground shimmered in patches of standing water, and somewhere beyond the shed a bird was already testing its voice against the silence. Inside, the stove had gone cold, but the memory of warmth still lingered in the air. Her two uninvited guests, now dry and looking considerably less bedraggled, were seated at the low table, speaking in hushed tones. They seemed to pause when they saw her rise, as though they weren't entirely sure if they were still intruding. Amina moved with her usual unhurried grace, rekindling the fire and setting a pot of water to boil. The quiet of the morning felt different now, altered by the fact that she was not alone. She could sense their eyes following her as she worked, and after a while the man, whose name she had learned was Daniel, asked the question that had been hovering in the air since they'd first stepped inside. "How did you make this place into this?" He gestured broadly, as though no single word could encompass what he saw. It was not often that Amina spoke at length about her life here. Most people never asked, and those who might have asked were never allowed close enough to see the contrast between the shed's exterior and the home it hid. But something about the night they had shared, the hours spent listening to the storm together, had softened the boundaries she kept so firmly. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she poured the boiling water over ground coffee, letting the aroma fill the room before taking her seat at the table. She folded her hands around her mug and considered where to begin. When she had first inherited the shed from her grandfather, it had been little more than a shell. The boards were warped, the roof leaked in 3 places, and there was no floor to speak of, just packed dirt that turned to mud when it rained. In the early days, she'd stood in the doorway and wondered if she was a fool for thinking she could live there. But the thought of renting another cramped apartment in the city, of returning to the noise and the constant press of people, was worse. She wanted space, not just in the physical sense, but in the way her life could unfold without someone else's approval or interference. The first weeks had been the hardest. She slept on a borrowed cot under a tarp, waking to the sound of wind threading through the cracks in the walls. She scavenged wood from discarded pallets and old barns, slowly replacing the most rotted planks. For insulation, she found leftover rolls from a construction site, trading a set of hand-thrown mugs for the privilege of hauling them away. It was exhausting work, often lonely, but every repair felt like a claim staked on her future. The windows came next. She knew the space needed light, real, living light that could warm the air and reveal the textures of the wood. She learned how to frame openings in the walls without compromising their strength, salvaging panes of glass from a demolished school. Carrying them home in the back of a borrowed truck, she had felt a swell of pride that startled her. Fitting them into place, she saw the transformation begin in earnest. The shadows receded, and the shed began to breathe. Electricity was a more complicated matter. The property was too far from the main lines to make connection affordable, so she turned to solar power. Second-hand panels, scratched but functional, found their place on the roof. A local handyman, more curious than judgmental, helped her set up the battery bank in exchange for a painting she had done years before. The first night she switched on the lamps powered by her own system, she sat for hours just watching the light fall across the walls, astonished that it was hers. Water had to be coaxed from the sky itself. She installed gutters along the roof's edges, leading into large barrels set beside the shed. Each barrel fed into a filtration system she had built from layers of sand, charcoal, and gravel. It wasn't glamorous, but it was clean, and it meant she didn't have to haul water from town. The rhythm of maintaining it became part of her days, checking the barrels after every rain, listening to the steady drip that signaled the cycle was working as it should. The furnishings were never bought all at once. They arrived in her life the way most good things did, unexpectedly and often in need of repair. A pair of armchairs rescued from the curbside, their frames still sound beneath the worn fabric. A low table from a carpenter's shop, its surface marred by decades of use, but strong enough to last decades more. Even the rugs had stories. One was traded for a week's worth of bacon, another given in thanks for helping an elderly neighbor restore her garden. She took each piece into her care, sanding, polishing, mending, until it felt like it had always belonged to the space. Her workshop had grown almost without her noticing. At first, it had been just a corner with a few tools and a box of supplies. Over time, as she began to sell her pottery and sewn goods at the market, it became a place where she could lose herself for hours. Clay under her nails, the hum of the wheel, the quiet satisfaction of turning raw material into something beautiful and useful. These were the things that sustained her. Each object she made felt like an affirmation that she had been right to choose this life, however strange it might seem to others. As she spoke, the expressions on Daniel and his companions' faces shifted from simple curiosity to something more thoughtful. They asked about the trades she'd made, the skills she'd had to learn, the times she doubted herself. Amina answered honestly, even about the moments when the work had seemed endless and the isolation heavy. She told them about the winter when the roof nearly collapsed under the weight of snow, about the summer she'd lived on little more than vegetables from her garden and bread she baked herself. She spoke of the triumphs, too. The first fire in the newly sealed stove, the first night she slept without feeling the wind slide under the door, the first morning she woke to find sunlight spilling across the quilt she had stitched by hand. There was no boasting in her voice, only the steady cadence of someone telling a truth that had been shaped over years. She wasn't trying to impress them. She was simply answering the question they had asked, showing them the path from what had been to what now was. And in doing so, she found herself seeing it all again through fresh eyes. The choices, the persistence, the quiet victories. It made her realize how deeply this place was tied to who she had become. When she fell silent at last, the only sound was the gentle simmer of the pot on the stove. Outside, the storm's aftermath lay over the land like a damp blanket, but inside there was a sense of clarity, as though the telling of her story had cleared some hidden air. Daniel and his companion exchanged a glance that Amina could not quite read, but there was a softness in it, a kind of respect that had not been there the day before. She rose to tend the fire, and as she did, she thought about how rare it was for anyone to hear this story from her own mouth. Most people saw only the outer shell, the weathered boards and the crooked door, and never thought to ask what lay behind them. These two had stumbled upon it by accident, drawn in by circumstance, and now they would leave with a different understanding, not just of the shed, but of the life it sheltered. Whether they shared it or kept it to themselves, Amina knew that a part of her story now lived outside these walls, and for once, she didn't mind. The rainwater barrels outside were still brimming when Daniel and Mara, she had finally introduced herself the night before, prepared to leave. The clouds had begun to lift, revealing pale patches of sky that promised a clearer day, though the ground remained sodden. Amina stood by the door, watching them gather their belongings, the small talk of departure filling the space between them. She expected to feel relief at their leaving, the way she always did when her solitude was restored, but the sensation was different this time. There was no impatient longing for silence, only a calm curiosity about what they would carry away with them from this unexpected visit. As they stepped outside, boots squelching in the mud, Daniel paused and looked back at her with an expression that seemed more deliberate than casual. "You know," he began, shifting the strap of his bag on his shoulder, "you could do something with all of this. Your work, your home, it's remarkable. People would want to see it." Mara nodded, adding that she had friends involved in local arts programs and that Amina's pottery and textiles would be a perfect fit for an upcoming exhibit in town. They spoke of it as though it were obvious, a natural progression, and their words hung in the damp air between them. Amina's first instinct was to deflect, to offer a polite smile and let the idea slip away unacknowledged. For years, she had kept her life contained within the bounds of this property, every choice aimed at reducing outside interest. The thought of inviting strangers into her space, or even sharing pieces of it beyond these walls, felt like tearing a seam she had spent years sewing closed. She thanked them for the thought without committing to anything, her tone measured, but the suggestion lingered like a faint echo as she watched them walk toward the road, their figures shrinking against the washed-out landscape. The shed felt unusually still when she returned inside, the absence of their voices more noticeable than she had expected. She moved through her morning routine, but her mind kept circling back to their proposal. It wasn't that she doubted the quality of her work. She knew the care she put into each piece, the way her hands shaped clay or coaxed a stitch into place until it was just right. It was the exposure she feared, the vulnerability of stepping into a public space and allowing her creations and by extension herself to be examined. In her experience, attention was a double-edged thing. It could bring opportunities, but it could also invite intrusion, judgment, and misunderstanding. That afternoon, she walked into town for supplies, her boots leaving dark imprints on the still damp road. The air was clean in the way it only was after rain, carrying the scent of wet leaves and distant wood smoke. As she entered the market, she felt the familiar shift in the room, the subtle glances, the small gap of silence that closed over once she was among the shelves. It had been this way since she first arrived, the weight of unspoken speculation pressing against her back. Usually she ignored it, but today, for reasons she couldn't quite name, it felt more acute. She caught sight of a flyer on the bulletin board near the register, an announcement for the very arts program Mara had mentioned, bold letters promising a celebration of local talent. Her eyes lingered on it longer than she intended. By the time she returned home, the light was beginning to fade. She set her bag of groceries on the counter and stood for a long moment in the center of the room, taking in the familiar lines and textures. The polished beam overhead, the shelves of carefully arranged pottery, the quiet order of her workshop. It was all so much a part of her that she sometimes forgot how it might appear to someone seeing it for the first time. Daniel and Mara's astonishment had been genuine. She had seen it in the way they slowed their movements, in the reverent quiet that had settled over them once the initial surprise passed. Perhaps they were right that others would respond the same way. And perhaps, just perhaps, there was a way to share without surrendering the privacy she valued. Still, the thought made her uneasy. That night, sleep came slowly. She lay beneath the quilt she had stitched from salvaged fabric, listening to the wind's gentle sweep against the walls. Her mind shifted between images. The shed, as it had been when she first inherited it, raw and unwelcoming. The countless hours she had spent restoring it. The way Mara's hand had traced the grain of the low table as if committing it to memory. She wondered what it would mean to open herself to something new after years of choosing the familiar. In the days that followed, small signs of change began to ripple through the town. She noticed more faces turning toward her as she passed, their expressions tinged not only with curiosity, but with a kind of speculation she hadn't seen before. It was as if word of her home had begun to circulate, though she could not be sure whether Daniel and Mara had spoken of it or whether the story was simply growing on its own, fueled by the fertile ground of small-town gossip. Snippets of conversation reached her in passing. Mention of that place on the edge of town and the woman who turned a shed into something else entirely. There was no malice in the words she overheard, only an undercurrent of intrigue. A week later, a letter arrived in her postbox, hand-delivered rather than sent through the postal service. The envelope was unmarked except for her name, and inside was a single sheet of thick paper bearing an invitation to the arts program's opening night. It was unsigned, but the neat Lupin handwriting suggested Mara's hand. Amina set it aside without making a decision, but it lay there on the kitchen counter for days, catching her eye whenever she passed. Her routines remained unchanged, tending the herb pots, shaping clay on the wheel, mending the worn edges of the quilt. But there was a new thread running through them now, a quiet awareness that the world beyond her walls might be shifting. She found herself wondering, as she worked, what it would be like to see her pottery on a table surrounded by strangers, to hear their comments, to watch their hands lift a bowl or trace the curve of a mug. Would it feel like a violation, or would it affirm something she hadn't realized she needed? The turning point did not come with a sudden epiphany, but rather with a slow accumulation of moments. One afternoon, as she was arranging newly fired mugs on the shelf, sunlight poured through the window in such a way that the room seemed to glow from within. She imagined, just for a heartbeat, how that sight might strike someone seeing it for the first time, someone who didn't know the years of labor hidden beneath the beauty. It struck her, then, that the home she had built was not only a refuge for herself, but also a testament to what could be made from what others cast aside. Perhaps sharing it was not about inviting judgment, but about offering proof of what was possible. She still didn't know if she would accept the invitation, but the idea no longer felt like an intrusion. It felt like a door she could open if she chose, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel the urge to lock it again. The invitation lay on the counter for nearly a fortnight before Amina finally picked it up again. By then, the edges had begun to curl slightly from being handled and set down so many times. She turned it over in her hands that morning, while the kettle hummed on the stove, tracing the loops of Mara's handwriting as though the answer might be hidden in the strokes of ink. Outside, the frost had softened the ground, and the light, spilling through the window, carried the pale clarity of early winter. The quiet was as she liked it, unbroken save for the creak of the old beams and the occasional distant call of a crow. Yet the stillness that had once felt like safety now seemed, in some subtle way, to be holding her in place. When she had first built her life here, every moment of solitude had been a relief. It had meant no demands, no explaining herself, no eyes measuring her worth against the strange yard and weathered boards. But now she found her thoughts wandering to the idea of that exhibit in town, to the faces she might see there, to the possibility of her work standing beneath lights that were not her own. It was a thought she had pushed aside again and again, but it kept circling back, persistent as the wind that always found its way through the smallest gaps. That afternoon, she took the long path into town, the one that wound past the bare fields and the old mill, its wheel frozen in place for the season. The walk gave her time to think, to let the question settle against the rhythm of her steps. By the time the first rooftops came into view, she had not decided whether she would accept, but she knew she would stop by the community hall to at least see what the preparations looked like. Curiosity, she told herself, nothing more. Inside the hall, the air was warm and carried the faint scent of varnish and pine. Tables had been arranged along the walls, some already draped with cloths in deep winter colors. People moved between them, placing objects carefully: paintings, knitted scarves, carved wooden boxes. No one noticed her at first, and she used the moment to take in the scene. There was a kind of quiet industry in the way they worked, each person absorbed in arranging their pieces just so. It wasn't the hurried, competitive energy she had feared. It was slower, more deliberate, as if everyone there understood they were building something together. Mara spotted her near the doorway and crossed the room with a smile that was neither surprised nor pushy, as though she had known Amina might come. They spoke for a few minutes, Mara explaining that there was still space if she wanted to bring her pottery or textiles. There was no pressure in her tone, only the offer, as simple and open as a held hand. Amina found herself agreeing to think about it, but this time the words weren't a shield, they were a genuine promise. Back at the shed that evening, she stood in her workshop, looking over the pieces she had made in recent months. Bowls with fine, repeating patterns carved into their sides. Mugs glazed in earthy tones that reminded her of the land after rain. Small, woven mats stitched from fabric she had saved over the years, each one carrying a fragment of a past project. She began to imagine them on a table in that hall, lit by the warm overhead lamps, touched by the hands of strangers. Instead of dread, she felt an unexpected flicker of pride. These were not just objects, they were proof of her persistence, of her ability to turn neglect into beauty. In the days that followed, she worked with a quiet focus, selecting the pieces that felt most like her and packing them carefully. The decision, once made, seemed to lighten something in her. On the morning of the exhibit, she walked into town with a crate in her arms, the cold air biting at her cheeks. People greeted her along the way, some with polite nods, others with a hint of warmth that hadn't been there before. It occurred to her that news of her participation had already spread, and, for once, she didn't mind. The hall was bright with activity when she arrived. She found her place along one wall and began arranging her work, the familiar motions grounding her in the unfamiliar space. As the hours passed, the room filled with visitors, their voices mingling in a low, pleasant hum. She watched as people stopped at her table, leaning closer to examine the details, running their fingers lightly over the smooth glaze or the textured stitching. Some asked questions about her methods, about the materials she used, and she answered without hesitation. It felt natural, almost easy in a way she had not expected. By the end of the evening, she had sold several pieces, but more importantly, she had seen the expressions on people's faces when they looked at her work. There was recognition there, and appreciation, unclouded by the assumptions they might have made from the shed's exterior. For those few hours, she had been a part of something larger than herself, and it had not diminished her solitude. It had added to it, layering it with a new kind of connection. When she returned home that night, the shed welcomed her as it always did, warm and softly lit. She set the empty crate by the door and moved through the room, touching the familiar surfaces, feeling the deep comfort of being back in her own space. Yet something had shifted. The walls seemed to hold not only her own story now, but the echoes of those who had seen it through her work. She understood, in a way she hadn't before, that she could share parts of her world without losing it. She left the exterior unchanged, the paint still peeling, the weeds still waving in the wind, because the disguise still served its purpose. But inside, she knew the truth had begun to travel beyond these walls, carried by those who had seen what lay within. And as she sat by the stove, the lamp casting its familiar glow across the room, she felt no need to guard it quite so fiercely. The life she had built here remained hers entirely, yet now it was also, in some quiet, lasting way, part of the wider world. Subscribe to the channel, watch our next videos, and share this one with your friends.